Welcome back. Well, through the afternoon, you would have seen some of the National Police Commissioner Kehla Sithole's testimony at the Human Rights Commission hearings about what happened in KwaZulu-Natal during the violence in July. It's during these hearings that we get a much fuller picture of what exactly happened. But you can see some of the problems that this may pose for journalists, for example, particularly when a situation is moving quickly. How do you describe what is happening? And you can see this happening quite often. Sometimes the first information about an event can indicate that this happened. It's only months later that a court or a judge or an inquiry says, well, all of this happened as well. Benedict Phiri is an attorney and legal analyst. Dr. Guy Lamb is a criminologist who's studied crime for many, many years. Gentlemen, good afternoon to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time. Benedict, if I may start with you, this happens quite often. Let me give you an example. You have an incident, say, in a shopping centre, a woman goes up to a man and shoots him in front of witnesses. That could be described as a killing, and it could be described as a murder. Is there a legal difference between those two terms?
Yes, Stephen, I think there is a nuance in the terminology, because when we speak of a murder, we speak of an unlawful and intentional killing of somebody. So the very act of killing is part of the definition of murder, but what needs to accompany your act, the definition of a killing, what needs to accompany your act of killing a person for it to be classified as a murder is for it to be intentional and unlawful. Unlawful meaning that the law does not attach any lawful excuses, such as an excuse of self-defense, for instance. But when we talk about killing, it could be that a person is killed, but that does not constitute a murder because there is a lawful justification that allowed the circumstance to continue, and also it is not intentional. So there is a fine distinction, even though the act of killing falls within the definition of murder.
So someone who sees this incident in a shopping centre where this woman goes up to this man and what they see is her pulling out a gun and shooting this person. But it could turn out that a court says, well, actually, she was completely justified. Maybe, I don't know, maybe she was actually a police officer and this person was escaping the scene of a crime and there was intelligence he was on his way to commit further crimes and to murder more people. Maybe there was a justification in that she had just found out that he had abused her daughter or something like that. So at the beginning, we would call her a murderer. Anyone who saw that would call her a murderer. A court might find that she isn't.
That's correct. That's correct, because at that point in time, as us witnessing, and as much as we can see some of the elements that are playing themselves out in front of us, we may not have, for instance, the full context that allows for exculpatory reasons or reason to justify what was happening in such a manner that the law does not attach to that the label murder.
Dr. Lamb, we have crime scenes moving quite quickly, and this didn't used to happen 30 or 40 years ago where people would report on something. There wouldn't be such a demand for information. Let me give you another example. The Oscar Pistorius situation. We remember 8 years ago, Valentine's Day, Reeva Steenkamp had been killed. It was a long time before you could call him a murderer, and yet, I think many people at the time had made their minds up, and there was a huge hunger for information, which places a lot of pressure on everybody.
Absolutely. If we add the kind of issue of the role of the police to all of this, of course, a killing happens, so we have a perpetrator and we have a victim or victims or multiple perpetrators and multiple victims, and the police get involved, and they would be involved in the kind of classification of the act. So, for example, they may say that a murder case has been opened, for example, and hence the term murder gets used, or a case for murder is being investigated. So they may not say that they've opened a murder case, but they may be investigating. So this certainly complicates the matters, and also if we do not have all the evidence in front of us, then it is very difficult to make these judgment calls. But in the day of the nature of information and kind of news media outlets and sort of self-journalism and citizen journalism and Twitter and all forms of social media, people are looking for followers, looking to create content, and you actually want to use sensationalist language to get people to follow you, to follow your tweets, to follow your stories, to follow your commentary. So this really kind of adds a whole new dimension to it.
I find, Dr. Lamb, maybe it's just my experience, but there's also a demand that people make judgments very quickly. You must call someone a murderer. You must call them a this. You'll have other people who will say, no, they're not a murderer at all. And so suddenly everyone involved, whether they're journalists and I would say police spokesperson, I'd never want that job, find themselves under a lot more pressure than they were in the past.
Absolutely, because it's around, we want to categorize people. We want to kind of point fingers at people. We want to kind of understand in a way, but also it's about stereotyping. So, for example, you have a angry man of a certain age, who fits a certain stereotype, and you have a woman who fits another sort of stereotype as an innocent victim who is shot. And then those stereotypes automatically inform the use of the language. And, in many circumstances, it is the case that the person turns out to be a murderer, but in other circumstances, it's not the case at all. So, of course, the kind of strong language has very serious implications.
Benedict, there's also the passage of time here. I mean, there's an example which I don't think an appeal's been filed, but there was a person in Makanda who was convicted of rape by a magistrate. Then 2 judges acquitted that person, but there could be an appeal. So this person could have been found guilty, so would be called legally a rapist, then would be acquitted, no longer could be called a rapist, but could later be called a rapist again.
It's very confusing, Stephen, but I think the labeling is important from a legal perspective, because, in South Africa, for instance, we have minimum sentencing legislation framework, which means if you've basically perpetrated a murder for your first time, you're looking at 15 years or less if the judge can justify it, and it goes up depending on how many repeats or repeat offender you are. Similarly, murder with aggravating circumstances can attract life, and a murder that is done accidentally doesn't necessarily attract the level of punishment as we'd see on the other side of the scale. So the labeling does matter. And unfortunately, where we have a situation where a person loses and they technically can be called a rapist and then wins an appeal and it's no longer the case, unfortunately, we have to deal with that just simply because from a legal perspective, there are consequences attached to those particular terms.
Dr. Lam, I mean, there's another word which, relates to some of what we've seen with the testimony in KwaZulu-Natal, around the word massacre. And I'm deliberately going to use a different example because we have more distance, and it's maybe a little more helpful. I'm going to talk about what happened at Marikana in 2012. So many people call that a massacre. I don't know if police officers would call it a massacre, and this is where it gets complicated, because police were also involved. So now you can have a big argument about the words, about which word to use. The police often, the first sort of official confirmation of something that happened. Marikana, we actually had third hand because there were so many journalists there. So we had first-hand witness testimony from people who were sort of professional witnesses in the case of journalists, and you had video evidence. But what I'm saying is, at the very beginning, you might have called Marikana, say, a killing. Then we had a very long process of an inquiry. We still don't actually have murder convictions for that yet.
I mean, the term massacre is certainly bandied around. I mean, we've had conversations about, load shedding and blackouts in recent weeks around what is the technical term to use there. And you've had Andre de Ruyter coming, in the kind of public space and saying, this is what a blackout is, this is the technical term, and this is what we should be talking about. And of course, there was a major conversation about that. When in terms of massacre, it's traditionally used to refer to a mass killing by representatives of the state, so police, military, paramilitary, or even kind of groups, sort of civil groups that are affiliated to the state or have engage in violence that is sanctioned by the state. So that's typically when we talk about a massacre, it's mass violence that's perpetrated by government officials or those, under the auspices of the state that will kill a number of people. So often the term is not used when, for example, it's been used in the context of the unrest and the looting in KwaZulu-Natal, in the context of Phoenix as well. But technically that's not a massacre because it wasn't the state that did it. Where Marikana was quite a clear case. You got the state that perpetrated the violence, whether it was in defense, in the case of the TRT members who did most of the killing in Scene 1. But the term is often misunderstood. So often it's used to describe mass killing for reasons of drama. It's used a lot, for example, in the US, where we see these mass shootings, where you've got individuals who, kind of go into cinemas and shoot a number of people, and it's referred to a massacre. But from a very technical term, it's usually about the state that's perpetrating the violence.
Benedict, I mean, there's an interesting thing where I think as a society we don't always use the legal phrases. I mean, I don't think we should necessarily use the legal phrases. It's a free country. It does mean, though, that the original reporting, in a way, the first reporting really matters. I mean, first impressions count. And I think these are cases, Marikana, perhaps Phoenix, the shootings in the US. I mean, those are all examples of that.
Yeah, and let's be fair, you know, we don't always speak in a technical way, and often in the context of, for instance, reporting, it may not draw the type of consequences that it would draw if I use the terminology, for instance, in court. But I think we should allow for a greater nuance, a greater sensitization where possible, because language is diverse, it changes quickly. You know, new words get coined each and every single time to try and speak to a specific situation with precision. Often that's not the case, but I think that's just the nature of language.
Dr. Lamb, I mean, part of this is around the rush to judgment. And I think that's also human. I don't know if, I mean, with the best will in the world, I don't know if we'll ever stop doing that.
I don't think so either. It's also about to try and make sense of what's going on. And it's about, you know, if we're trying to understand what's going on, if we give it a term, then it kind of helps explain it. And I think for many people, it's certainly about biases that they may have to describe it. But often it's about, you know, to try and like really draw attention to this particular issue. So, for example, if you see there's been a case of, you know, 1 or 2 people who have been killed, where, you know, that story might not draw certain attention, where a massacre might draw certain attention. And then, you know, Stephen, in the media industry, there's certain media outlets that will use a lot more sensationalist language to attract readers or speak to a certain kind of base that they want to speak to. And of course, that gets picked up by other people. So language is really important here and often can lead to some unfortunate developments thereafter. It's about, if, you know, a lot of attention is then attracted to that particular issue. You may actually even see, as we've seen in cases, where there's sort of panic that emerges as a result of certain incidences and terms that are used that may lead to further unpleasant consequences such as vigilante acts. So I think language can be very powerful and can have consequences too.
Dr. Guy Lamb, a criminologist at the University of Stellenbosch, thanks very much indeed. Benedict Phiri is an attorney and legal analyst. Thank you both very much indeed. It's important.